Hey, I'm shaking it, hitting buttons. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. So, Mark chapter 12. We will be wrapping it up this morning as we look at the widow and her two mites. So, Jesus is wrapping up his final day of teaching at the temple. So we actually, in Mark, we've been going for a few chapters here, the triumphal entry, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, right? We're going through this here. And so the last thing before he leaves the temple is he's going to see this widow. He's going to give a talk at the temple. I'm kind of jumping ahead here. But Jesus is going to give a talk at the temple. And then he's going to do like a deeper teaching or a parallel teaching on the Mount of Olives. I'm getting ahead of myself because that's really tomorrow and not today. But tomorrow we'll see how Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record a very similar sermon. But when you hold Luke up next to Matthew and Mark, what you'll find is that Luke has a lot of differences. And some think it's just like, well, they weren't recorded accurately or whatever. That's why they used it. No, I think it's because Luke was a different sermon. And so really that's the second to last thing that would happen in between the widow's mites and what we see in chapter 13. But let's take a look at the widow's mite. So Jesus is at the temple. And it says, Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how many people put money into the treasury. And many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which makes a quadrans. So he called the disciples to himself and said to them, assuredly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. Now, oh, buggers, I'm going to have to look around because the reality is I don't think John, I'm going to back up. John, nope, no, too far, too forward, too far, too back. Let's see here. The widow's mites, the poor widow, verse 42. Let's see here. She puts in her lepta. What is Joe doing right now? Well, what Joe is doing right now is seeing if maybe Joe has numbers written down in his Bible. Let's see here. One mite is a lepton, which is half of a quadrant. There you go. It's half a quadrant, which is 1/8 of a serion. I think I have that right. My writing's not that great. Which is 1/128th of a denarius. So, when you put all that down now, here's the deal. So I've heard it taught before that this is only like a fraction of a cent. And that's kind of true. So if you ever heard someone teach and say, well, these 2 mites, it's like a fraction of a penny. Right. But don't forget that like a generation ago, I remember your grandparents, my grandparents, right, talked about how, well, back when they were a kid, you could buy a nickel could buy you all this stuff. So a couple thousand years ago, a fraction of a cent went a little further. But one way of looking at it is this. Let's say you make $25 an hour, right? And you work an 8-hour day. So you make yourself $200. Now, it's not a lot of money, but when I went through and did the math, the money she gave wasn't just fractions of pennies, because I'm throwing this out because fractions of pennies we think of as almost worthless. And obviously that's like a great contrast because Jesus says what she gave was a great amount. But in reality, if you do your math, And I had the math more specifically written down. I really should just write that in my Bible here in Mark's gospel. It's one of those ones where sometimes if I don't have it in this gospel, I have it in that gospel. It actually, I'm going to jump over to Matthew real quick because I'm thinking to myself, Matthew 24, I don't even think it's just like, yeah, doesn't have the widow's mites. So, yep, don't have it written down. But when I did the math, that money was enough for a meal. The 2 mites was enough money that it had a practical use. And so this woman who is giving up her 2 mites, it was actually enough money that she could have gone and bought herself something. But she didn't. She gave it to the Lord. And of course, Jesus said, "Assuredly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who've given to the treasury, for they all put out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood." And so that's the idea. If you're a poor person and you're a beggar, and you find you've only begged enough to provide 1 meal for you that day, that night, but as you go by the house of the Lord, you decide, I'm going to give this meal to the Lord. She's made a sacrifice. See, that's the idea, is it the 2 mites weren't just so little that it was worthless. It actually had a worth. And I think that's the heart behind it. I mean, think about it. If the 2 mites was so little you couldn't even buy anything, then what's the deal? Just give it to, it's like, I'll be honest, something that convicts me, one reason I'm thankful, there's not a right way or a wrong way to gather tithes and offerings, but I know I've seen, just like change in the plate. That idea of giving God our pocket change, giving God what's left. And that's not what the widow was doing, right? It wasn't like, well, here, I've got this, so I'll give it to the Lord. It could have bought her the dinner she needed that day, but she gave it to the Lord anyway. Last Tuesday, 1 week ago today, our youth was going through Genesis. We actually had a side conversation that went for over an hour. But I was like, well, we need to at least do something in the Bible. So I'm going to paraphrase Genesis 23, because that's where we were going to start. I thought we were going to do multiple chapters. But I said, Genesis 23 is Sarah dying, and then Abraham goes to purchase the cave of Machpelah. And there in Hebron, and he was going to buy it as a place, and the guys wanted to give it to him. What's this between us? You just take it, Abraham, because he was a wealthy guy, and he was a well-known guy, it seems. And so people would just, oh, no, it'd be an honor to give it to you. But no, he insisted. Oh, well, it's worth 400 shekels. He's like, then 400 shekels you shall get. Why? Because Sarah was his bride, and he didn't want her to be in a freebie cave. Even if it's the exact same cave, he desired to spend for his wife. We see in 2 Samuel 24, David going up to get the threshing floor, the future location of the temple. And the guy says, here, David, you can have it. And David says, no, I will not offer to the Lord my God that which cost me nothing. And so there is this principle that goes through the entire Bible, from Genesis to Samuel and the kingdom age, or the age of the kingdom of Israel, to the time of Jesus, that God does measure our sacrifice based on what it costs us. And it is true that some people give out of their abundance. Enrique just made a comment, so I'll use him as an example. Enrique's got nothing better to do with his time, right? And so God's just like, Enrique, you need to be serving me like 8 hours a day because you're single. You don't got kids, you don't got a wife, boom. But, and I'm teasing Enrique some, but I want to make this point. For some of you, when you've got a lot of kids and you've got a lot going on, God knows it's a sacrifice to cut out a night of your week to make it to church, or to cut out something here and cut out something there. And God sees that. Giving out of the proportion of what you have to give. And some people have very little time to give. Some people have very little money to give. Some people have very little of whatever, but God knows. And at the end of the day, he's checking hearts. He sees the heart behind the giving. What was it now? I just saw a meme the other day. There's this video, right? And so maybe you've seen the video. Like, I just saw a meme made from the video. I'd never seen the video of Oprah Winfrey and Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, together doing this selfie video, asking people to donate to the fires in Maui. And someone makes this meme and they bring up the point. It's like, when a billionaire and a multimillionaire are asking you to donate money. And it really is. It's like, wow, it's so kind of them to ask us to donate money. But I bet you if every person who watched that video gave, Oprah has more that she could give if she really wanted to. And that's kind of the thing. It's when you have so much, it's not a big deal. Oprah could give $100,000 easier than most of us could give $100. And Jesus knows. And so with the widow and the mites, I think it's important for us to know that it did cost her. It wasn't like 2 mites was worthless. 2 mites had a value to her. And she gave that to the Lord. I don't think God is asking all of us to give everything. In fact, maybe a side rabbit trail teaching that's kind of important too is I've known people who are very giving, but the problem, my opinion problem, maybe the Lord's leading them differently than I think, but is they gave so much all the time that they ended up crippling themselves to where they were barely able to get by on their own. And sometimes I wonder if the Lord was leading them to give or they just like giving. But then again, if you put yourself in a position where you have to borrow from other people, well, maybe the Lord wants you to manage better. And it's also worth noting, having a plan. I know with Nicole and I, we've always kind of followed the heart behind Dave Ramsey's live like no one else so that one day you can live like no one else. And I know I've heard, and that's his common saying, and he also makes the point, so that one day you can give like no one else. And that's always been the goal. Make wise choices, suck it up, and don't get all that nice stuff that all your other 20-year-old friends are getting or all your other 30-year-old friends are getting. I mean, that's the idea, is living and just making wise choices and investments that don't pay out for a while. But then, if the Lord tarries, being put into a position where you can really help a lot of people. And so, the name of the game, though, is where our hearts are at with giving. And it doesn't matter if you don't have a lot to give. God looks at the proportion. God looks at the cost. Some people, $100 is a big deal. And other people, it's not a big deal. And if 2 people gave $100, God sees the difference. That's the moral of the story. God knows what level of sacrifice. And so that's what David said. I will not give the Lord that which cost me nothing. He knows that it had to be a sacrifice for it to be a real offering. And that's where we see Abraham saying, no, my wife, my bride, she deserves better than a free cave. I'm going to pay for it because it needs to be a sacrifice because she is worth it. And here the widow giving numerous times less than all these other people, but it came at a sacrifice. And so that's the idea of offering God sacrifices, is they're supposed to be a sacrifice. And so, yeah, that's it. The moral of the story of the widow and her 2 mites is God knows how much of a sacrifice it is for you to give whatever it is you give. And if you give out of your abundance, it's not that it doesn't count. But if you give out of your poverty, well, God knows. When you wake up early to spend time with him and you're tired, God knows. But you're doing it faithfully. God knows. And so he knows the heart behind your giving. He knows the sacrifice you are doing to give. So there we go, church. All right. We get to move into some eschatology tomorrow. That'll be fun. End time stuff, chapter 13. I'm sure we'll be in there for multiple days as we move on through. So, God bless you guys. Have a great day. And I will see you guys bright and early tomorrow.